The alarm had not even finished its first note when the doors of the council chambers sealed shut, and I was still inside. My name is Vren Kessa, and I have served as a junior attaché for the Osceline Compact for 6 cycles. I was not supposed to be important that day. I was supposed to stand near the back wall, hold a data tablet, and nod when my superior nodded. Instead, I found myself pressed against cold stone, with my hearts pounding in 3 different rhythms, staring at a door that had just locked every delegate in the room inside, with whatever had triggered the alarm in the first place. I want to tell you how I got to that moment. I want to tell you why, when the doors finally opened again, I was no longer afraid of the thing that had caused the alarm. I was afraid of the guard who answered it. 3 months earlier, I had never given much thought to the beings who stood at the doors of the council chambers. They were furniture to me, fixtures. You walked past them the way you walked past a support column, trusting it would hold the ceiling up without ever wondering how. That changed on the morning the Velkarn Sentinel Corps stepped aside after 11,000 years of service, and a single, unarmored human took their place at the eastern entrance. I remember the murmur that went through the observation gallery. 11,000 years is not a small number. The Velkarn had guarded this chamber before my own species had learned to build cities that could stand through a storm. They wore ceremonial plating that gleamed under the chamber lights. They moved in perfect formation, and there were always at least 6 of them at any single doorway, rotating in careful shifts so that no one guard ever grew tired enough to make a mistake. On that morning, there was one human. He did not wear plating. He wore a simple dark uniform with no ornamentation at all, and he carried a sidearm that looked almost apologetic next to the ceremonial halberds the Velkarn had carried for millennia. He walked to the door, turned to face the room, and stood still. He did not shift his weight. He did not check the time. He did not speak to the attaché stationed near him, though she tried twice to make polite conversation before giving up. He simply stood, eyes moving slowly across the room every few moments, and then returned to stillness. I leaned toward my superior, a broad-shouldered Osceline elder named Doran Vale, and I whispered the question that every delegate in that gallery was thinking. Why only one? Doran did not answer right away. He watched the human for a long moment, the way you might watch a storm cloud that has not yet decided whether to break. Then he said something I did not understand at the time. 1 is enough, and 11,000 years was not. I laughed, because I thought it was a joke. Doran did not laugh. He turned back to his notes and did not speak of it again that day. I could not let it go. That night, back in the small quarters assigned to junior staff, I pulled up every record I could find on the vote that had removed the Velkarn Sentinel Corps from its post. I expected controversy. I expected outrage from a dozen species who had trusted those guards for longer than my own civilization had existed. Instead, I found something stranger. I found silence. The vote had passed without a single member abstaining. Species who agreed on almost nothing else, species who had fought wars over trade routes and terraforming rights and the correct temperature for a diplomatic reception, had all voted the same way on this single matter. Humans, and only humans, would guard the council chambers from that day forward. There was no public debate recorded. No dissenting statement, no formal explanation entered into the record beyond a single line attributed to the outgoing chair of the Security Committee, a Velkarn elder named Isotep Ren. The line read simply, "We have seen what happens when the guard hesitates, and we do not wish to see it again." I did not know what that meant. I did not know what had happened to make 11,000 years of unbroken service end so quietly, with no ceremony and no argument. But I knew that whatever it was, it had frightened beings who did not frighten easily. I decided I would find out. I did not know yet that finding out would place me, 3 months later, on the floor of the council chambers, with the doors sealed, and my life depending entirely on the calm, unhurried footsteps of the very guard I had once dismissed as a strange replacement for something older and grander. The following week, I requested a meeting with a retired member of the Velkarn Sentinel Corps. This was not easy. Most of the old guard had scattered across the compact worlds after their post ended, and many did not wish to speak about their service at all. I finally found one willing to talk, an elder named Corin Dale, living in quiet retirement on a garden world 3 jumps from the council homeworld. Corin was old, even by Velkarn standards, his plating long since traded for simple robes, his posture still holding the careful discipline of a lifetime spent standing guard. He received me in a small room overlooking a lake, and for a long while he said nothing at all, simply studying me the way a teacher studies a student who has asked a question they are not certain they are ready to hear the answer to. "You want to know why we left?" he said finally. I told him yes. I told him I had read the vote, read the single sentence about hesitation, and understood none of it. He nodded slowly, as though he had expected exactly that response. "Let me ask you something first," he said. "When you imagine a guard, what do you imagine they are protecting against?" I thought about it. "An intruder," I said. "A weapon. Someone who means harm to the people inside." "Close," he said, "but not quite. A guard is not there to protect against a weapon. A guard is there to protect against a moment. A single moment where harm becomes possible, and someone must decide, in less time than it takes to think the decision through, whether to act." He rose from his chair and walked slowly to the window, looking out over the still water of the lake. "The Velkarn Sentinel Corps was built on discipline," he said. "We trained for 1,000 years to react without fear. We believed we had removed hesitation from ourselves entirely. We were wrong. We had not removed it. We had only buried it so deeply that we could not see it anymore, until the day it mattered most." He did not tell me the full story that day. He said it was not his alone to tell, and that other records existed if I wished to find them, though he warned me that some of those records were not pleasant to read. He did tell me one thing before I left, a single observation that stayed with me through everything that followed. "Every species that has ever stood guard," he said, "has carried something with them into that post, a rule they will not break, a cost they are not willing to pay. An enemy who studies you for long enough will always find that line, and once they find it, they will walk straight through it, because they will know, with certainty, that you will stop just short of the one thing that would have saved everyone." I asked him what humans carried instead. He was quiet for a long moment. "Nothing that I have ever been able to find," he said, "and that is precisely why the vote passed with no debate at all." I left his home with more questions than I had arrived with, and a growing unease that I could not quite name. I did not yet know that the answer to Corin Dale's unfinished story was waiting for me in the sealed archives of the Council itself, in records that very few beings outside the Security Committee had ever been permitted to read. I did not yet know that within a matter of weeks, I would be granted access to those records, not because I asked for them, but because the events of that day in the Council chambers would make my curiosity a matter of official concern. For now, I only knew that something had happened during the final years of the Velkarn Watch. Something bad enough that 11,000 years of trusted service had ended not with honor, but with a quiet, unanimous vote and a single guard standing where 6 once stood. I returned to my post at the Council homeworld unsettled in a way I could not explain to my colleagues. I began watching the human guards more closely after that. I noticed things I had not noticed before. The way their eyes tracked exits before they tracked faces. The way they positioned themselves not for comfort, but for angle. Always angled toward the widest possible view of the room, never with their back fully exposed to open space. The way they never seemed bored, even after standing motionless for hours, because their stillness was not the stillness of inattention, it was the stillness of readiness. I asked Doran Vale about this one afternoon, as we walked the long corridor toward the delegate quarters, after a session had ended. He considered the question longer than I expected before answering. "You have noticed the difference then," he said. I told him I had. I told him it felt less like watching a guard, and more like watching a predator, that had simply chosen, for the moment, to be still. Doran nodded slowly. "That is not far from the truth," he said. "Every species the Council has ever trusted with this post approached the role the same way. They saw themselves as a wall, a barrier standing between danger and the people they protected. A wall can be strong, a wall can be tall, but a wall does not move, and eventually, every wall is tested by something that finds a way around it, or over it, or through it, given enough time." He stopped walking and turned to face me fully. "Humans do not see themselves as a wall," he said. "I have spoken with several of them about this directly, and each one described their role differently, though the meaning was always the same. They do not think of themselves as something standing between harm and the room. They think of themselves as the last thing that harm will ever encounter, and they mean that in the most literal sense a being can mean anything. I did not fully understand what he meant. Not then. I understood the words, but not the weight behind them. I would not understand that weight until the day the alarm sounded, until the doors sealed, until I watched a single human guard walk toward the source of danger instead of away from it, with a calm that I can only describe now as the calm of someone who had already decided, long before that moment arrived, exactly what he was willing to do, and precisely what he was not willing to allow. That understanding was still weeks away from me. For now, I only had questions, a growing list of unread records, and a strange, persistent feeling that the Council had not simply hired a new species to guard its most important room. It had made a choice that every other species in the chamber understood, on some instinctive level, even if none of them would say it aloud. They had stopped looking for the strongest guard. They had started looking for the guard who would never, under any circumstance, stop. I did not know yet how right Doran Vale would prove to be. I did not know that within a matter of weeks, I would watch that principle proven in a way that would change how I understood not just the humans, but every species I had ever called an ally, myself included. I did not know that the calm, quiet figure standing at the eastern door, the one I had once mistaken for an unremarkable replacement of something grander, was in fact the answer to a question the galaxy had been asking, in one form or another, for longer than my own people had kept written history. I only knew, walking back to my quarters that evening, that I wanted to understand why, and the archives, I was certain, held the beginning of that answer. The archive request took longer to process than I expected. Records concerning the final years of the Velkarn Sentinel Corps had been marked with a security classification I had never encountered before in my 6 cycles of service, a classification that required sign-off from 3 separate committees before a junior attaché like myself could be granted access. I was prepared to be refused. Instead, to my surprise, the request was approved within a single day, with a short note attached from Doran Vale himself, stating that my inquiry had been logged as part of an ongoing review of chamber security protocols. I did not ask him why he had done this. I suspected, even then, that he wanted me to understand what he already knew, and that he believed the truth would serve me better than a comfortable silence. The records opened onto a single incident, logged 18 years before the vote that ended the Velkarn Watch. I read it twice before I believed what I was reading, and then a third time because some part of me hoped the details would change if I looked closely enough. The Council had convened an emergency peace summit between 2 long-warring factions, a summit considered so fragile that a single wrong word from either delegation could have collapsed years of careful negotiation. Security for the summit had been assigned to the full Velkarn Sentinel Corps, 12 guards stationed throughout the chamber, each one among the most decorated in their order. During a recess in the proceedings, while both delegations mingled under careful watch in an adjoining hall, an infiltrator gained access to the building. The records did not specify the infiltrator's species or affiliation, only that they had passed through 3 separate layers of security undetected, using credentials that later investigation proved had been forged with technology far beyond what either warring faction was believed to possess. The infiltrator's goal, as reconstructed afterward, had been simple and devastating: not to attack the delegates directly, but to plant a device timed to detonate during the closing ceremony, an event that would be attended by nearly every senior official from both factions at once. A single moment, carefully chosen, meant to erase an entire generation of leadership in one strike and plunge both sides back into a war that had already cost uncountable lives. The device was discovered with less than 4 minutes remaining before it was set to activate. It was discovered by a single Velkarn guard, stationed nearest the recess hall, who noticed a discrepancy in the identification badge of a support staff member moving through a restricted corridor. The guard's report, preserved word for word in the archive, described a hesitation of perhaps 6 seconds. 6 seconds spent weighing the correct protocol. 6 seconds spent considering whether raising an alarm without absolute certainty might cause a panic that could itself collapse the summit. 6 seconds spent, in the guard's own written words, trying to find a path that resolved the threat without violating the strict rules of engagement the Velkarn Corps had followed without exception for 11,000 years. Those 6 seconds were enough for the infiltrator to reach a secondary exit and vanish into the crowded hall beyond, blending among hundreds of delegates and support staff from a dozen different worlds. The device was found with 11 seconds remaining, not by the guard, but by a maintenance worker who happened to notice it while performing an unrelated inspection. It was disarmed with 4 seconds to spare. The margin between a successful summit and a catastrophe that would have reshaped galactic history for a century came down to a span of time shorter than it takes to draw a full breath. I sat with that record for a long while before I could bring myself to read the rest of it. The Council's internal review that followed did not blame the guard for cowardice. The report was careful, almost gentle in its language. It stated plainly that the guard had followed every protocol correctly, had shown exceptional judgment under pressure, and had made a defensible decision at every single point along the way. And yet the review concluded with a finding that I have not been able to stop thinking about since the day I first read it. The failure was not a failure of the guard. It was a failure of the guard being a being at all. The report went on to explain what it meant by this. Every decision the guard had made in those 6 seconds had been correct, according to the standards the Velkarn had trained toward for 11,000 years. Verify before you act. Consider the wider consequence of an alarm raised in error. Preserve the dignity and safety of the proceedings above the urgency of an unconfirmed threat. These were not flaws. They were the very foundation of what had made the Velkarn Sentinel Corps trusted for so long. And it was precisely because these values were so deeply, so correctly embedded, that an enemy clever enough to study them could exploit the gap between suspicion and certainty, and walk through it unharmed. The infiltrator was never found. The device's origin was never conclusively traced. The summit succeeded, against all odds, but the Council's Security Committee spent the following 18 years quietly studying every guard species available to them, searching for something that could close that gap entirely. I want to be honest about what I felt reading this record, because I think it explains everything that came after. I did not feel afraid of the infiltrator, whoever they had been. I felt afraid of the 6 seconds. I felt afraid of how reasonable those 6 seconds were, how completely I understood the guard's reasoning, how certain I was that I would have made the exact same choices in the exact same order, and how close that reasonable, careful, correct chain of decisions had come to erasing an entire summit's worth of hope in a single burst of light. I brought my findings to Doran Vale the following morning, expecting him to be surprised that I had uncovered so much so quickly. He was not surprised at all. He listened to my summary in silence, and when I finished, he simply nodded, as though I had confirmed something he had known for a very long time. "There is more to the record than what you found," he said. "The committee's search for a replacement did not end with a simple decision to hire humans because they seemed capable. It ended because of a single test, conducted 11 years after the incident you just described, that the committee has never made fully public." I asked him what the test had involved. He told me that the Security Committee, still searching for a guard species that could close the gap the Velkarn incident had exposed, had constructed a controlled scenario. A simulated infiltration, run without warning against several candidate species serving trial postings at minor council facilities, designed specifically to recreate the conditions of the original incident as closely as regulations allowed. Suspicious but unconfirmed evidence. A ticking, narrow window of time. A choice between certainty and speed. Every species tested, Doran said, hesitated in some form. Some hesitated for verification. Some hesitated out of concern for causing unnecessary alarm. Some hesitated because their cultural protocols required consultation with a superior before independent action could be taken. Saley, the length of hesitation varied. Its existence did not. "Every species except one," he said. I did not need to ask which. The human candidate, upon encountering the simulated discrepancy, did not pause to verify. Did not pause to consider the social cost of a false alarm. Did not pause to seek permission. According to the sealed test record, the human moved to neutralize the simulated threat within a span of time so short that the committee's own instruments initially registered it as a system error, believing no organic being could have processed the scenario and acted in so brief an interval. When questioned afterward about the speed of the response, the human's answer was recorded in full, and Doran recited it to me from memory. in a tone that told me he had read those words more times than he could count. I was not thinking about whether I was right. I was thinking about what happens if I am right, and I do nothing. I sat with that sentence for a long time, after Doran left me alone in the corridor that evening. I turned it over the way you turn over a stone to see what lives beneath it. I understood, finally, what Corin Dale had meant when he told me that every species carries something with them into the role of guardian. A line they will not cross. A cost they are not willing to pay. I understood that for every species before humanity, that line had been drawn somewhere before the moment of action. Verify first. Consult first. Weigh the cost of being wrong before committing to being right. For the human in that test, the line had been drawn somewhere else entirely. Not before the moment of action, but before the moment of inaction. The cost that mattered was not the cost of raising a false alarm. It was the cost of standing still while something real slipped past. I did not yet know that within a matter of weeks, I would find myself standing in a sealed chamber, watching a human guard make that exact same calculation in real time, not in a simulation designed by a careful committee, but in a moment where the stakes were as real as they had ever been for the Velkarn guard, who hesitated, 18 years before humanity ever set foot in that chamber at all. For now, I only knew that the vote which had once seemed so strange to me, so sudden, so unanimous without a single word of public debate, made a terrible kind of sense. The council had not been looking for the strongest guard, or the most disciplined, or the most experienced. They had been looking for the one who would not need 6 seconds to decide that action was worth more than certainty. They had found it. And in finding it, they had also found something that unsettled nearly every other species in the chamber, myself included, though it would take me a while longer to understand exactly what that unsettling feeling was, and why it never fully went away, even after I came to trust the guard at the eastern door more than I trusted almost anyone else in that entire building. I did not have to wait long to see that unsettling calm applied to something real. It happened during a routine session, the kind of gathering so ordinary that half the observation gallery had stopped paying close attention, myself included. We were reviewing a trade dispute between 2 outer colonies, a matter so dry that Doran Vale had allowed himself to close his eyes for what he called a moment of deep consideration, though I suspected it was closer to sleep. The human guard on duty that day was new to me. I had seen him only twice before, standing at the western entrance during evening sessions, always still, always watching. His name, I would later learn, was Ethan Marsh, though on that day he was simply the guard, a quiet fixture at the edge of my vision that I had long since stopped consciously noticing. The first sign that something was wrong was so small that I almost missed it entirely. A support technician, one of dozens who moved through the chamber during any given session, adjusted a cable near the base of the speaker's podium. It was an unremarkable action. Technicians adjusted equipment constantly, and no one in the gallery so much as glanced toward it. Ethan Marsh glanced toward it. I noticed him notice, only because I happened to be watching him at that exact moment, curious about the way he stood so differently from the delegates around him. I saw his eyes shift, hold, and narrow slightly, the way a hunting animal's eyes narrow when it catches a scent that does not belong. He did not move from his position. He did not speak, but something in the quality of his stillness changed, and I felt, without understanding why, a small chill move through me. The technician finished adjusting the cable and moved away, disappearing through a side door that led toward the maintenance corridors beneath the chamber. To everyone else in that room, the moment had already ended. To Ethan Marsh, it had not. He crossed the chamber floor in a manner I can only describe as unhurried urgency, a contradiction that should not have been possible but somehow was. He did not run. Running would have drawn every eye in the room and possibly triggered a panic that could have been worse than whatever threat he suspected. He simply walked, quickly, directly, toward the same side door the technician had used, and he spoke a single word into the small communicator at his collar as he moved. I did not hear the word clearly, but I saw its effect. Within seconds, 2 more guards, one human and one from a species I did not recognize, moved with quiet purpose toward other exits of the chamber, sealing them without announcement, without alarm, without a single delegate in the gallery noticing that anything at all had changed. I woke Doran Vale with a gentle touch to his arm. He opened his eyes, took one look at my expression, and sat up immediately. his own attention sharpening at once. "What is it?" he whispered. "I do not know," I told him, "but something is happening." We watched together as the side door opened again perhaps 90 seconds later. Ethan Marsh emerged first, his expression unchanged, his posture exactly as calm as it had been before he crossed the room. Behind him, 2 additional security personnel escorted the support technician, whose posture had changed entirely. Where before he had moved with the easy confidence of routine work, he now walked stiffly, flanked closely on both sides, his face pale in a way that told me, even from a distance, that whatever had happened in that corridor had not gone the way he expected it to. Most of the delegates in the gallery never noticed anything had occurred at all. It was only later, through Doran's connections within the security committee, that I learned what had happened in those 90 seconds, and why Ethan Marsh's quiet, unhurried walk across the chamber floor had likely prevented something far worse than a trade dispute from ever being remembered by history at all. The cable the technician had adjusted was not faulty equipment. It was a small transmitting device, designed to relay the exact positioning and shift patterns of chamber security to an outside party. Information that would have been useless on its own, but became extremely valuable when combined with other intelligence the committee later discovered had been gathered over several months. The technician himself was not the mastermind of the plan, merely a paid intermediary, but under careful and lawful questioning, he provided enough information to identify a small group planning to disrupt an upcoming summit, one considered even more delicate than the trade dispute that had served as cover for the day's session. What struck me most, when I finally learned the details, was not the plot itself, though it was serious enough. It was the explanation Ethan Marsh gave when the security committee asked him, formally, what had drawn his attention to a technician performing what appeared to be routine maintenance. I read his statement weeks later, once Doran had arranged for me to review the incident file as part of my ongoing inquiry. The statement was short, direct, and utterly without embellishment, the way I had come to expect from every human record I encountered. He said that the technician had adjusted the cable with his left hand, while his right hand remained pressed against his side in a way that did not match the posture of someone simply crouching to reach equipment. He said the technician's eyes had moved to the exits twice in the span of a few seconds, a pattern he described as checking an escape route rather than checking for a supervisor's approval, which was the far more common glance among chamber staff. He said that none of these details, on their own, meant anything conclusive, but together, in that specific combination, they meant enough that waiting for further confirmation was a risk he was not willing to accept. I asked Doran, when we discussed the file together, why the other guard on duty that day, the non-human security officer who had helped seal the exits, had not noticed the same details. Doran's answer stayed with me long after our conversation ended. He noticed some of them, Doran said. He told the committee afterward that he had also felt something was wrong about the technician's manner, but he described waiting for a clearer signal before acting, a habit so deeply trained into nearly every guard species the Council has ever employed, that most of them do not even recognize it as hesitation. They believe they are simply being thorough. They believe they are simply being careful, and in nearly every circumstance, that carefulness serves them well. It is only in the rare, narrow moment where carefulness itself becomes the danger that the difference becomes visible. I thought back to the 6 seconds from the record I had read weeks before, the 6 seconds that had allowed an infiltrator to escape with a device that came within 4 seconds of ending a fragile peace. I thought about how those 6 seconds had not come from carelessness or incompetence, but from the same careful, reasonable instinct that had just been described to me as a virtue in every other guard the Council had ever trusted. I began to understand something that troubled me more than I expected it to. It was not that humans were braver than other species, though perhaps that was part of it. It was not that they were faster, or stronger, or more perceptive, though their perception in that moment had certainly proven sharp. It was that somewhere in the architecture of how they weighed a threat against the cost of acting on unconfirmed suspicion, the balance simply tipped differently than it did for every other being I had ever known, myself included. I found myself, in the days that followed, watching Ethan Marsh with a kind of attention I had never given a guard before. I noticed the way he positioned himself not for comfort during long sessions but always for the widest possible field of view. I noticed the way his eyes moved in patterns, tracking not just faces but hands, not just entrances, but the small services corridors that most delegates never gave a second thought to. I noticed that he never seemed to relax, not truly, even during the quietest and most tedious sessions, and yet there was nothing frantic or anxious about his vigilance. It was simply constant, the way breathing is constant, requiring no visible effort and yielding no visible fatigue. Doran noticed my growing fascination and, one evening as we walked the long corridor back toward the delegate quarters, offered an observation that I have carried with me ever since. "You are trying to understand what makes them different," he said. "I understand the instinct. I felt it myself, many cycles ago, when I first served on this committee and first studied their history in detail. But I will tell you what I eventually concluded, and you may find it more useful than anything else I have told you so far." I asked him what that conclusion was. "It is not that humans lack the fear the rest of us carry," he said. "I have spoken with several of them at length, and I do not believe for a moment that Ethan Marsh felt no fear crossing that chamber floor toward a threat he could not yet confirm. I believe he felt exactly the fear any of us would feel. The difference, as best as I can determine, is that his fear did not sit in the same place as ours. Our fear asks us to wait until we are certain. His fear, if the accounts I have gathered are accurate, asks him to move before the danger has the chance to become certain at all." I did not fully grasp what Doran meant that evening, though I would come to understand it with painful clarity in the weeks that followed, when the calm, unhurried certainty I had come to associate with Ethan Marsh would be tested in a way that no simulation, no committee review, and no archived record could ever have fully prepared me to witness. For now, I only knew that something in the chamber had shifted for me personally. I no longer saw the human guards as fixtures at the edge of my vision, unremarkable and interchangeable with the ceremonial figures who had come before them. I saw them, for the first time, as something the rest of the galaxy had spent 11,000 years failing to build, and had finally, almost by accident, discovered already walking among the stars, waiting only to be asked. After the incident with the technician, I found myself unable to return to my ordinary duties without the question following me everywhere. I began spending my evenings in the public archive terminals, reading everything I could find about humanity's history, not the diplomatic summaries prepared for new council members, but the deeper records, written by human historians for human audiences, filled with details that had never been smoothed over for outside consumption. What I found there was not simple, and I want to be honest about that, because I think the temptation, when trying to explain something as strange as what I witnessed in the council chambers, is to reach for a single tidy answer. There was no single tidy answer. There was instead a long, layered history of a species that had spent most of its existence in conflict with itself, long before it ever met another species among the stars. I read about wars fought over land, over belief, over resources that in hindsight seemed almost absurdly small compared to what was at stake. I read about betrayals and alliances that shifted within single generations. I read about individuals, ordinary people with no special training and no special power, who had chosen, again and again throughout that long history, to stand between danger and people they had never met, simply because standing there was possible and no one else was doing it. I found records of rescuers who walked toward burning structures while everyone else walked away. I found records of individuals who gave up food, shelter, safety, and eventually their own lives, for strangers who could offer them nothing in return. I found records of soldiers who, faced with certain personal loss, chose to shield companions with their own bodies, without a visible moment of hesitation. Actions, later historians described using a phrase that struck me deeply when I first read it. They did not have time to be afraid, because they were already moving before the fear could catch up. I began to understand that what I had witnessed in Ethan Marsh was not an isolated trait, bred specifically for guard duty. It was something older, something woven through the entire history of the species, expressed differently, in different individuals and different eras, but present again and again, in a pattern too consistent to be coincidence. I brought this observation to Doran one evening, and he listened with the particular stillness he reserved for moments he considered important. "You have found what the security committee found," he said, though it took them considerably longer, and with far more resources than a single junior attaché reading archive terminals after her duties end each day. I asked him to explain further. He told me that the committee's original search, following the incident 18 years before the vote, had not begun with humans at all. Humanity had been a relatively minor voice within the council at that time, newer to galactic affairs than most of the species under consideration, and initially overlooked entirely. The committee had instead tested older, more established species first, species with long traditions of martial discipline and centuries of dedicated security service. Every one of them, Doran said, produced guards who were skilled, disciplined, and reliable in the overwhelming majority of circumstances. And every one of them, when tested against the narrow, specific scenario the original incident had exposed, hesitated in some measurable way. It was only when a mid-ranking committee member, reviewing unrelated diplomatic files, came across an account of a human emergency worker who had continued pulling survivors from a collapsed structure long after every safety protocol dictated that the structure was too unstable to enter again, that the committee began to look more closely at humanity as a candidate. What they found, across thousands of historical records spanning the entirety of recorded human history, was a pattern that no other species tested had shown to nearly the same degree. Not an absence of fear, not a lack of self-preservation as a concept, but a willingness, present with striking consistency across cultures, eras, and individuals who otherwise had nothing in common with one another, to set that self-preservation aside, the instant another life was at risk, without requiring extensive deliberation first. I asked Doran why he thought this was true. I asked whether he believed it was something biological, something taught, or something else entirely that neither of us had the framework to properly name. He considered the question for a long time before answering, and when he did, his answer was more thoughtful than I expected. "I do not believe it is any single thing," he said. "I have read theories from human scholars themselves on this very subject, and even they do not fully agree. Some believe it comes from the sheer scale of loss the species endured throughout its history, a scale so severe in certain periods that entire communities were shaped by the understanding that survival often depended on strangers choosing to help other strangers, without guarantee of anything in return. Others believe it is simply a trait that persisted because it worked, because communities that produced individuals willing to act quickly and decisively in defense of others were, in the long run, communities that survived circumstances that destroyed communities who did not." He paused, then added something that I found more unsettling than comforting, though I understood, even then, why it mattered. "Whatever the cause," he said, "the effect is what matters to us. And the effect is a species that, more consistently than any other the Council has ever studied, treats decisive protective action not as a last resort to be weighed carefully against other options, but as something closer to an immediate reflex, triggered the moment a threat to another life becomes plausible, rather than confirmed." I thought about the technician in the corridor, about the 6 seconds from the original incident, about Ethan Marsh crossing the chamber floor with unhurried urgency toward a threat he could not yet prove existed. I began to understand that what unsettled the other delegates about the human guards was not a lack of empathy or caution. It was, strangely, the opposite. It was an excess of protective instinct so consistent, so immediate, and so unclouded by the layers of careful deliberation that governed nearly every other species, that it became almost impossible to predict or manipulate. This, I came to understand, was precisely why the enemies of the Council feared a single human guard more than they feared an entire fleet of warships. A fleet could be avoided. A fleet's movements could be tracked, its patrol patterns studied, its response times calculated with enough precision to plan around. A human guard standing at a single door offered no such comfort. There was no gap to exploit, no 6-second window of careful deliberation waiting to be found and walked through. There was only the certainty that the moment a threat became plausible, someone would already be moving to meet it, and that whoever planned that threat would have no meaningful warning before it happened. I raised this thought with Doran, half expecting him to correct me, to tell me I was overstating the matter. Instead, he nodded slowly and told me something that the committee had apparently concluded independently, years before I ever set foot in the council chambers. "You understand it correctly," he said. It is not that humans are unbeatable. They are not immune to harm, and several have paid a great personal cost for the very instinct we are discussing, a cost the committee does not take lightly, and never has. But an enemy does not need their opponent to be unbeatable in order to be deterred. An enemy needs only to believe that the cost of testing that opponent will be paid immediately, decisively, and without the narrow window of hesitation that every previous guard, however skilled, eventually offered. Humans do not offer that window, and an enemy who cannot calculate the window at all will very often choose not to test the door in the first place. I sat with that thought for a long while after our conversation ended. I thought about 11,000 years of careful, disciplined, honorable service from the Velkarn Sentinel Corps, service that had protected this chamber through countless crises and had only failed once, in a single, narrow, understandable moment of careful deliberation. I thought about how that one failure, small as it seemed against 11,000 years of success, had been enough to convince every species on the council, without a single word of public debate, that careful deliberation itself had become the single greatest vulnerability standing between this chamber and the next catastrophe waiting to be planned against it. I did not yet fully understand what it would feel like to depend on that instinct myself, to have my own safety rest entirely on a guard's willingness to move before certainty rather than after it. I would learn that lesson soon enough, in circumstances far more immediate and far more personal than any archive record or committee interview could have prepared me for. For now, I closed the terminal, walked back to my quarters through the quiet evening corridors of the council homeworld, and found myself, for the first time since arriving in that building, grateful, rather than unsettled by the sight of a lone human figure standing motionless at a distant doorway, watching the empty hall with eyes that never seemed to rest. It took me another 2 weeks to find the courage to speak with Ethan Marsh directly. I am not certain why the prospect made me nervous. I had spoken with delegates from a dozen species, negotiated minor disputes on behalf of my own government, and stood in rooms with beings powerful enough to end my career with a single word of complaint to my superiors. And yet the idea of approaching a quiet, unarmored guard at the eastern door felt somehow more daunting than any of that. I think, looking back, it was because everything I had learned about him up to that point had come from records and second-hand accounts. I had read his statement about the technician. I had heard Doran's theories about human history and human instinct. I had built, in my mind, an image of something almost mechanical, a being defined entirely by readiness and reflex, with little room left over for anything as simple as conversation. I was wrong, and I am glad I was wrong. The opportunity came during a quiet evening shift, long after the day's session had ended and most of the delegates had returned to their quarters. I had stayed late, reviewing notes for an upcoming committee meeting, and found myself walking past the eastern door on my way out of the building. Ethan Marsh stood there as always, still and watchful, though the chamber behind him was empty and dark. I stopped, and before I could talk myself out of it, I asked whether he minded a brief conversation. He looked at me with an expression I had not expected, something warmer than I had imagined possible from the calm, unhurried figure I had watched cross that chamber floor weeks before. He said he did not mind at all, and that most delegates walked past him for months without ever saying more than a polite greeting, so a real conversation was, in his words, a nice change of pace. I asked him, somewhat clumsily, about the incident with the technician. He answered without hesitation, walking me through the same details I had already read in his official statement, though hearing them in his own voice, unfiltered by the formal language of a committee record, made them feel different somehow, more human, if I can use that word without irony. I asked him whether he had been afraid, crossing that chamber floor toward a threat he could not yet confirm. He considered the question seriously, the way a person considers a question they have thought about many times before, but have rarely been asked so directly. Yes, he said, I was afraid. I think anyone who tells you they were not afraid in a moment like that is either lying or has not actually been tested yet. Fear is not the problem. Fear is useful. It sharpens you. The problem is letting fear decide what you do next, instead of simply informing it. I asked him what he meant by that distinction, and he explained it more plainly than any archive record or committee theory had managed to. He said that fear, left unchecked, asks a person to wait, to gather more information, to make certain before committing to anything irreversible. He said that instinct served people well in almost every circumstance in life, and he did not consider it a flaw in the slightest. But he said that in the specific, narrow role he had chosen to occupy, waiting was itself the irreversible choice, because the moment danger became certain was very often the same moment it became too late to stop. So I try to flip it, he said. Instead of asking myself whether I am certain enough to act, I ask myself what happens if I am right and I do nothing. If the answer to that question is something I could not live with, then I act, even if I am not fully certain. I would rather explain an overreaction to a committee than explain, to myself, why I stood still while something I suspected turned out to be true. I told him this sounded like an enormous weight to carry, making that calculation again and again, day after day, for every small, ambiguous moment that crossed his field of view. He smiled slightly at that, though there was something tired behind the smile that told me the weight was real, whatever calm exterior he presented to the room. It is a weight, he agreed, but I did not arrive at carrying it by accident, and I do not carry it because I believe I am owed anything for it. I carry it because I decided, a long time ago, that if I was ever standing in a position where I could act between someone and harm, I would rather carry that weight every day of my life than carry the memory of having chosen not to, even once. I asked him, carefully, whether he had ever chosen not to, and regretted it. His expression changed then, something guarded passing behind his eyes before he answered. Once, he said, and did not elaborate further, and I did not press him. I understood, from the way he said the single word, that whatever memory it referred to was not something he offered to strangers, however curious they might be, and I respected that boundary without needing it explained to me. We spoke for a while longer about smaller matters, about my own homeworld, about the strange customs of council life that I still found difficult to navigate after 6 cycles of service. He asked thoughtful questions and listened carefully to my answers, and I found myself, somewhat to my own surprise, genuinely enjoying the conversation, the way I might enjoy speaking with any thoughtful colleague, rather than a figure I had spent weeks studying from a cautious distance. Before I left that evening, I asked him one final question, the one that had been sitting at the back of my mind since the very first day I watched him take his post at that door. I asked him what he would actually do, in the clearest and most literal terms, if someone tried to bring real harm to the delegates inside that chamber while he stood on duty. He did not flinch from the question. He did not soften it or redirect it, or offer the kind of careful diplomatic non-answer I had grown so accustomed to hearing from nearly everyone else in that building. I would stop them, he said simply. Whatever that requires, in whatever order it needs to happen, I would stop them before they reached anyone in that room. I am not interested in being remembered as someone who tried. I am only interested in the room staying safe. There was no boastfulness in the way he said it. No performance. No attempt to impress me with the weight of his own resolve. It was stated the way a person states a simple fact about themselves, something so thoroughly settled within him that it required no embellishment at all. I walked back to my quarters that night, turning his words over carefully in my mind. I had expected, going into that conversation, to find either a cold professional reciting protocol or a quietly troubled figure carrying some hidden burden that explained the intensity I had witnessed weeks before. I found neither. I found someone warm, thoughtful, capable of genuine conversation and genuine humor, who also happened to possess a resolve so complete and so unclouded by doubt that it had reshaped the entire security posture of the most important room in the galaxy. I understood, finally, what Doran had meant when he told me the calm I found so unsettling was not recklessness, it was certainty. But I understood something else that evening as well, something Doran's careful theories and the committee's clinical records had never quite managed to convey. That certainty did not come from an absence of feeling. It came from a person who felt everything just as deeply as anyone else, and had simply decided, with full and clear-eyed awareness of what it would cost him, exactly what he was willing to do about it. I did not know, walking back through the quiet evening corridors that night, that within a matter of days, I would watch that certainty tested in circumstances far more immediate than any hypothetical question I had asked at a quiet, empty doorway. I did not know that I would be standing inside that very chamber when the test came, trapped behind sealed doors with no way to leave, watching the calm figure I had just come to know as something more than a fixture prove, in the span of a few unbearable minutes, exactly how far that resolve was willing to go. The session that day had been called to finalize a vote on a matter more delicate than any I had witnessed in my 6 cycles of service, a resolution meant to bring a fragile ceasefire between 2 border factions into permanent, binding law. Every senior delegate from both factions was present, along with representatives from nearly every member species of the council, myself included, seated far closer to the main floor than my junior status would normally allow. There, only because Doran Vale had asked me to assist with a final review of the resolution's language before the vote began. I remember the room felt different that day, though I could not have told you why at the time. Perhaps it was simply the weight of the occasion, perhaps some part of me, after everything I had learned in the previous weeks, had grown more attuned to the small details that separated an ordinary session from something else entirely. The alarm began without warning, a low tone that built quickly into something sharper, and the great doors of the chamber sealed themselves before I had even fully registered what the sound meant. I remember the sudden stillness that followed, the way every delegate in that room froze in place, unsure whether to move, to speak, to reach for the emergency channels built into the arms of our seats. I looked toward the eastern door out of pure instinct, and Ethan Marsh was already moving. I do not think I can fully describe, even now, the way that movement felt to witness from the inside of that sealed room, rather than as an observer watching from a safe gallery weeks before. There was no panic in it, and yet it moved faster than anything I had seen from him previously, a controlled, purposeful speed that closed the distance between his post and the source of the disturbance before most of the delegates around me had even risen from their seats. The threat, I would learn afterward, had come from a small group who had gained access to the building disguised as part of the ceremonial honor guard traditionally present for a resolution of that magnitude, individuals whose credentials had been forged with the same troubling sophistication the security committee had noted in the incident from 18 years before. Their intent, according to the later investigation, was to disrupt the vote by any means necessary, and to ensure that the fragile ceasefire being finalized that day would collapse before it could ever take legal effect. I did not know any of that in the moment. In the moment, I knew only that the calm figure I had spoken with days before, the one who had told me plainly that he would stop anyone who tried to bring harm into that room, was crossing the chamber floor toward danger, while every instinct in my body screamed at me to find the nearest cover and stay as far from that danger as possible. What followed happened faster than my mind was able to fully process at the time, and I have had to reconstruct much of it afterward, through conversations with other delegates who were present, and through the official record that was later released to council members with appropriate clearance. I will not describe every detail of what occurred, both because some of it remains difficult for me to revisit even now, and because I do not believe every detail is necessary to understand what the moment meant. What I can tell you is this: Ethan Marsh did not wait for confirmation before acting. He did not wait for permission from a superior, or for a second guard to arrive and validate his assessment of the threat, or for the delegates around him to reach safety before he committed himself fully to the confrontation unfolding near the ceremonial entrance. He moved with a decisiveness that left no visible gap for hesitation to occupy, and within a span of time that felt to me both impossibly short and unbearably long, the threat to that room had ended. It did not end without cost. I watched, from across the chamber, as Ethan Marsh was struck during the confrontation, a moment that stole the breath from my chest more completely than the alarm itself had. I watched him continue regardless, finishing what he had started, before allowing himself even a moment's pause to acknowledge what had happened to him. It was only once the threat had been fully neutralized, once every delegate in that room could be certain the danger had passed, that he allowed himself to lower to one knee, and only then did the other security personnel who had been sealing the remaining exits rush to his side. I remember very little about the following minutes with any clarity. I remember the doors finally opening to admit medical personnel. I remember the room erupting into a confusion of voices, some delegates weeping, others shouting questions no one present was able to answer. I remember Doran Vale's hand on my shoulder, steady and grounding, as I sat frozen in my seat, unable to look away from the small cluster of medical staff working over the fallen guard near the ceremonial entrance. I learned later that his injuries, though serious, were not fatal, a fact that took days to feel real to me, even after I had confirmed it through multiple sources. I learned that the resolution, despite the disruption, was carried out to a successful vote later that same day, the delegates from both factions insisting, with a unity that surprised even the most seasoned council members present, that finishing what they had gathered to accomplish was the only response worthy of what had just been sacrificed to protect them. I did not speak to anyone for a long while after the session ended. I sat alone in the observation gallery long after the chamber had emptied, staring at the space near the ceremonial entrance where the confrontation had unfolded, trying to reconcile the calm, thoughtful person I had spoken with only days before, the one who had told me plainly and without a trace of performance exactly what he would do if this moment ever arrived, with what I had just watched him actually do when the moment came. I understood, sitting there in that empty gallery, that everything Doran Vale and Corin Dale had told me in the weeks before had not been theory or exaggeration. I had witnessed, with my own eyes, the precise thing that 11,000 years of careful, disciplined, honorable service from an entire order of guardians had never been able to fully guarantee. Not superior strength, not superior skill, though both had clearly played some part. What I had witnessed was the complete absence of the narrow window that every previous guard, however capable, had eventually offered to a patient enough enemy. There had been no 6 seconds spent weighing certainty against action. There had been no pause for confirmation, no hesitation born from careful, reasonable, deeply understandable instinct. There had been only the moment danger became plausible, and a person already moving to meet it, exactly as he had told me he would, exactly as the archive records had described, from a test conducted years before I ever arrived in that chamber, exactly as 11,000 years of a different kind of guardian had, in one narrow and costly moment, proven themselves unable to match. I sat in that empty gallery until the light outside the tall windows had faded entirely, and I found myself thinking not about fear, though fear was certainly present, but about the strange, quiet gratitude I felt toward a species that had, for reasons still only partially explained even by their own historians, decided that the cost of hesitation was simply too high a price to accept, and had built themselves, generation after generation, into something willing to pay a different cost instead. It has been several months now since that day, and I still find myself returning to that empty gallery from time to time, though the chamber is rarely empty anymore, and the memory has softened just enough to allow me to sit there without the same tightness gripping my chest. Ethan Marsh recovered fully, though it took considerably longer than any of us who cared about him would have liked. He returned to his post at the eastern door, on a quiet morning, much like the one I first witnessed all those months ago, standing exactly as still, watching exactly as carefully, as though nothing at all had changed. I went to greet him that morning, and he smiled at me in the same warm, unguarded way he had during our first real conversation, and told me it was good to be back where he belonged. I asked him, carefully, whether the events of that day had changed the way he thought about his own role. He considered the question for a while, the way he always did before answering something that mattered to him. It confirmed something I already believed, he said, rather than changing anything. I always knew the day might come where the calculation I described to you would cost me something real, knowing that day had finally arrived, and that I would make the same choice again without hesitation if it came a second time, told me I had been right to build my life around that choice in the first place. I have thought often, in the time since, about the report I read so many months ago now, the one with the single sentence attributed to Isotep Ren, the retiring Velkarn elder who oversaw the vote that ended 11,000 years of his order's service. We have seen what happens when the guard hesitates, and we do not wish to see it again. I understood that sentence intellectually the first time I read it. I understand it differently now, having watched with my own eyes what the alternative to hesitation actually looks like, having sat inside a sealed room while someone else's certainty stood between myself and a danger I still do not fully understand. I have come to believe that the title carried by this account, the strange and unsettling phrase the wider galaxy has quietly adopted to describe humanity's role within these chambers, is not an exaggeration born from fear or superstition. Every other species who has ever guarded this room, including my own, brings with them a version of caution that serves them well in nearly every circumstance of life, and fails them only in the rare, narrow moment where caution itself becomes the greatest danger of all. Humans, for reasons their own historians still debate among themselves, do not carry that particular gap. And an enemy who studies a target long enough to find every weakness eventually learns that the surest way to defeat a guardian is to locate the space between suspicion and certainty, and walk calmly through it, while the guardian is still weighing the correct and reasonable response. There is no such space to walk through anymore. Not in this chamber. Not while a human stands at the door. I do not say this to diminish the guardians who came before, the Velkarn Sentinel Corps who protected this chamber with honor, for longer than my own civilization has kept written records, and who failed only once, in a single moment shaped by values that were never wrong in themselves, only insufficient for the one narrow circumstance that mattered most. I say it because I believe understanding why they were replaced, and understanding what replaced them, matters more than most delegates in this building have ever taken the time to consider. When the vote to renew humanity's post came before the council again, as it does every several cycles under standard council procedure, I found myself, for the first time in my career, permitted to cast an advisory recommendation on behalf of my delegation. I did not hesitate the way I once might have, before I understood any of what I have written here. I recommended renewal without qualification, and when a junior colleague of mine, newly arrived from my homeworld and unfamiliar with everything I had learned, asked me privately why the decision seemed so obvious to me, when it had clearly required so much unanimous, unspoken agreement from every other species in the chamber, I found myself giving her an answer very close to the one Doran Vale once gave to me. I told her that every species who has ever stood guard over something precious eventually discovers the particular shape of their own hesitation, and that discovering it is rarely a comfortable process. I told her that the galaxy had spent 11,000 years believing careful, honorable restraint was the highest virtue a guardian could offer, until a single, quiet, reasonable pause proved nearly catastrophic and forced every member of this council to ask themselves a harder question than they had ever wanted to face. Not which guardian is the strongest, or the most skilled, or the most honorable by the standards their own culture holds dear, but which guardian, when the narrow and terrible moment finally arrives, will already be moving before anyone else has finished deciding whether moving is the correct thing to do at all. I told her that the answer to that question, however unsettling it might feel to species who pride themselves on caution and careful deliberation, had already been proven, not through theory or committee simulation, but through a lived and costly moment inside these very walls. And I told her that I, for one, had stopped finding that answer frightening some time ago, because I had come to understand it not as the mark of something reckless or savage, exactly the opposite of what I had assumed on my very first day walking past that quiet eastern door, but as the mark of a species that had simply decided, individually and collectively, generation after generation, that the people standing behind them mattered more than the comfort of their own hesitation. That is why, when the vote is called again, I will vote the same way I voted before, and I suspect nearly every delegate in this chamber, regardless of the differences that so often divide us on every other matter before this council, will do exactly the same. Not because we no longer fear what a human guard represents. We do, in a way none of us discuss openly outside conversations like this one, but because we have come to understand that the fear belongs, rightly and permanently, to whoever might ever consider testing that door, and not to the people fortunate enough to stand safely behind it. I still see Ethan Marsh most mornings, standing quietly at his post, watching the chamber with the same unhurried patience he has always shown. I no longer walk past him the way I did during my first weeks in this building, treating him as unremarkable furniture at the edge of my vision. I stop, most days, and we exchange a few words before I continue on to my duties, and I find myself, each time, grateful in a way I still struggle to fully put into words, for the quiet, watchful certainty standing between this chamber and whatever the wider galaxy might one day decide to send against it. The Velkarn Sentinel Corps served this chamber for 11,000 years with discipline, honor, and near unbroken success. I hold nothing but respect for what they built, and for the single, understandable moment where their careful values proved, just once, insufficient against a patient enough enemy. But I have come to believe, having witnessed the alternative with my own eyes, that the council was right to seek something different once that single moment revealed exactly what was at stake. They found it in humanity, not because humans are without fear, or without doubt, or without the same aching uncertainty that lives in every thinking being who has ever stood between danger and the people they were sworn to protect. They found it because humanity, across the whole long and difficult span of its history, had already answered the hardest question a guardian will ever face, long before the Council ever thought to ask it of them at all. And that, more than any archive record, any committee theory, or any careful historical analysis I have gathered in the months since I first asked a simple, foolish question in a crowded observation gallery, is why humans, and only humans, are permitted to stand guard in these chambers. Not because the galaxy trusts them blindly, but because the galaxy has finally understood, through cost too heavy to ever forget, exactly what waits on the other side of a guardian who hesitates, and has chosen, without a single word of public debate, never to risk finding that answer again.